order to say, well, let's see, are we really up to it the way we were lucky enough to have those guys up to it in 1787? I mean, there was a bond that connected them. Even though they differed on issues like slavery, they'd all come out of the Revolution. They were lucky enough to have Hamilton, Madison, Franklin, and they had a George Washington to preside. I don't know what you think about the current cast of political characters, but I look around in vain to see a Hamilton or a Madison, or for that matter, a Franklin or a Jefferson, not to mention a Washington. It's great that we, people of very different views, can talk and converse, but the stakes in this conversation are relatively limited. We may convince ourselves and one another a little, but we haven't put the whole Constitution of the United States on the table, and it's actually served us pretty well. It's not as though it's been a massive failure. We did have to go through a civil war to overcome some of its deficiencies, but I think it's done pretty well by us. There's also a deep contradiction between what some people have to assume in order to favor a convention, to make deep structural changes. They have to assume that it's all up for grabs, that Article 5 is not going to be binding, that, for example, the rule that every state gets the same number of votes isn't going to be binding, and the point of view that others who want a convention for a more substantive purpose, like getting rid of Citizens United, or reducing the powers of the national government, or increasing the powers of the national government, those substantive objectives, the people who favor a convention to do something substantive tend to fall back, as the introductory materials for this conference do, on the idea that it all is going to fit neatly into the existing Article 5 framework that takes 3/4 of the states to ratify. Well, that's an assumption, of course, that you can't make if you really want to put the whole structure up for grabs. Now, there are people like Barbara Perry who argue that even though these legal questions are unanswered, there are something like half a dozen political constraints, although she included a Supreme Court check as among the political constraints, and I have my doubts about that. There are political constraints that can substitute for the legal ones under our current situation. But it seems to me that the very thing that is said to make a convention essential is the supposed failure of our political process. Its polarization, its paralysis, its capture by special interests. And to rely on that supposedly